Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Tom Lindsay, and to introduce our panel will be Larry Bell of the University of Houston. Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad to join this group today. I think it's going to be an excellent conversation, and a very important one. The coronavirus pandemic has accelerated a pre-existing transformational shift, both of the business and higher education communities, to telework and distance learning on virtual platforms. As such, there are a lot of uncertainties today regarding just when and how to safely reopen campuses, and how do we embrace the very uncertain future that's economically uncertain, as well as in terms of programmatically how this is going to affect everything. There can be great certainty, however, that the reopenings will open up very large financial and competitive intra-institutional market opportunities and challenges as well that are going to be very dramatic and in many instances very painful. Texas universities and colleges must compete with growing numbers of top-ranked institutions offering excellent degree-eligible and low-cost online options, which are disrupting traditional on-campus educational models. This reality has only become more urgent in the wake of COVID-19. What innovative and pragmatic administrative policies can guide excellence in this new market? What essential roles should Texas industries, businesses, and taxpayers play as supporting partners? We've got an excellent panel today to discuss this important subject. First, I want to introduce Tom Lindsay. Dr. Tom Lindsay was a distinguished senior fellow of higher education in constitutional business studies at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's been a very great privilege to work with Tom and get to know him. Dr. James Hallmark will be the panelist, is Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs within the Texas A&M University system. So that's a very large system and embraces a lot of campuses, large and small, that are doing, and it's quite diverse and serves a number of different communities in Texas. Dr. Debbie Thorne, Associate Provost in Academic Affairs at Texas State University, will be one of our panelists. And the Honorable Kirk Watson was an Associate Provost, and he's the founder of a new hobby college at the University of Houston, where I'm incidentally also teaching some 40 years now, remotely now in the fall. He's also a former Texas State Senator with a great interest in higher education. And Dr. Richard Johnson, who we're really pleased to have on board at Texas Public Policy Foundation, is the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative at TPPF. So with that, I'll turn the panel over to Tom Lindsay, who will be coordinating and moderating this.
Thank you, Larry. And Larry, you're right. We have a great panel, and the credit for that goes to you because you're the one who put it together. And in fact, this was your brainchild. So we at TPPF want to thank you very much for your hard work on this. Let's begin in alphabetical order with James Hallmark. Vice Chancellor Hallmark, let me ask you this to start off our questioning. Public education has moved forward for a couple of decades in online programming, but it's been an uneven path. What role has higher education played in online learning in the past? And in response to COVID, how do you see that developing in the future?
Thank you for the question, Tom. And I'm not sure that I've ever had Hallmark come up first in the alphabet, but I was quickly scanning the others' names to know who would be first. But I appreciate the question. And one of the things I think it's important for us to establish from the front is that this is not a matter of public higher education has not been engaged in online learning. And certainly in the A&M system, we have a significant number of programs many complete degree programs. We have 4 of our universities where the SCH and the head counts, SCH being student credit hour production, and the head count pre-COVID was running 25 to 30, 33% of the offerings. And so we have significant number of online programs in the A&M system and at other universities in the state, even at the flagship, which is a more selective institution, a more traditional institution in many ways. 10% of the SCH student credit hour production last fall at the undergraduate level, so this is the 18 to 22-year-old population, generally speaking, was online. So there's quite a bit going on. But that doesn't mean that it is an even progression. And I think there's some real gaps there that we've been able to identify and see where we can improve. And as Larry mentioned, there are online providers out there who are very competitive and are doing some outstanding work. But I will push that the public universities are doing well also, and certainly including the A&M system. When we look at where we're going from here, I think that there's an acceleration. What COVID has done is an acceleration of the integration of technology into higher education. We've been doing this. In fact, Debbie and I shared the other day that we both taught our first online course in 1999. This has been going on for a long time. But for our public universities, it's been a fairly slow, steady growth as opposed to a big jump in that growth, generally speaking, with some exceptions. And I think what you'll see with the integration of technology into learning at the public university space is the considerable acceleration in that trajectory. And some of that is market driven, some of that is response to the COVID-19, but there's going to be an acceleration on that. But I think at the end of the day, we also have to understand that there's different markets, that the market for higher education, the market for learning is not homogenous. There are individuals who are 40 years old who have no desire to ever set foot on a university campus, but need that learning. There's also a whole lot of 18 to 22-year-olds and 25 years old out there who this is the best form of learning for them to come to a university campus. And so what public higher education is doing is trying to integrate and serve both of those kinds of markets and the various sub-markets that go between. So that's how I would view that, is that we've been doing quite a bit. The virus makes us more aggressive in that area in terms of serving the different needs out there in higher education.
Thank you. So if I understand you correctly, this was an idea whose time had already come, but is now being expedited in light of COVID.
I think that's a fair characterization, is that we were already doing a lot, but there were a lot of gaps. And because of this, we've become more proactive in reaching those markets and reaching those classes that we hadn't previously considered how we could offer in an online environment.
Yes, thank you. Next, Richard Johnson, who it is my pleasure to work with at TPPF. Richard, I want to ask you about the CARES Act and whether and to what extent it addresses the digital divide as it relates to minority students that are economically marginalized.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be on this distinguished panel. One of the things that we want to talk about is the digital divide. I reached out to several HBCU presidents over the last week to have this discussion with them. And one of the things that they shared with me, that the digital divide is very, very real when you're looking at minority, economically marginalized students. And a couple of the things that they shared with me was speaking with Dr. Newman over at Jarvis Christian College. They did a survey, and of his students, 78% of those students had technology problems, did not have the hardware, software to move forward. And that's one of the things that they're needing to provide for them in terms of laptop, computers, and so forth. And also 73% of the students that he surveyed did not have Wi-Fi. So there's a need for the expansion of broadband services to go into those economically marginalized communities, because many of those students are going to be going back to very poor communities, which have a lot of the social issues that are going on in those communities, as you see, we're seeing right now play out before us on all the news cameras. And so basically, another thing, I'm just sharing some information that we received back from that survey that he did, which I thought was very, very interesting, is that many of them did not have places to study at home that were conducive for studying. And many of those students, the number one issue was stress. And so when we took a look at the CARES Act and we looked at minority students and historically Black colleges and universities, basically there's a lot of room there for the CARES Act to address those issues. And the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, along with the UNCF United Negro College Fund, have brought proposals forward to seek legislation to increase the amount of recovery services going to minority students and to historically Black colleges and universities. So we'll see how that plays out in the next bill that's coming forward through the CARES Act. So one of the things that I think that really stuck with me was that all of the professors and presidents that I talked to at HBCUs said that the digital divide is very, very real. They're experiencing that, and it's going to be a steep hurdle for them to climb and overcome in terms of the learning curve and moving from the traditional in-classroom service delivery to online services. And let me just say this as well, Tom. Most of your HBCUs were predominantly in classroom services, and very few had the infrastructure in place to make the kind of shift that COVID-19 is requiring to be made right now. So they're experiencing some, issues across the campuses because these campuses or these colleges and universities have very small endowments. So they don't have a huge rainy day fund. But the silver lining in this is necessity becomes the mother of invention. So now they're motivated to innovate. And one of the things that Dr. Newman shared with me is that they've come up with ways to incorporate Zoom conferences for support staff to and faculty and students to work together so that they can still kind of in somewhat of a way see one another and be in person. So they're coming up with innovative ways, and our colleges and universities will continue to do this, and I believe that they'll survive and thrive through COVID-19.
Well, that's encouraging to hear, Richard. I know the ancient Greek historian Herodotus said that change breeds illness in human beings, but it seems that it's also true that illness breeds change. And I'm hearing you say it might produce some good changes.
Absolutely, and I believe that it will. I have faith in the American institutions, and I have faith in our colleges and universities and the great minds that house our colleges, that are housed in our colleges and universities. The best thing about a college or university is that everybody's smart. Everybody around there is smart, so they can figure out they can figure out solutions to the problems. And I think that COVID-19 is going to force us forward. I think we heard that from our last panelist. COVID-19 is pushing us forward, and it is a time that has come for online services and learning.
Thank you, Richard. We turn next to Associate Provost Debbie Thorne. Debbie, let me ask you this. How does the emergency remote instruction that we all had to put into place in the spring of 2020, how and does that provide opportunities for further innovation going forward in higher education?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a perfect question as I follow Richard and his research and the results that he's hearing and even hearing about new strategies and new ways of thinking that HBCUs and other universities are employing. I do want to start out by admitting that I'm an eternal optimist. So I believe nearly everything can be improved. Before I joined higher education, I spent some time in product management, product development with Texas Instruments, and also have done a great deal of study looking at product and service innovation. And what I know deeply about innovation, that it requires both a personal mindset and an organizational mindset, that those two factors have to be in place in order for innovation to occur. The other concept is never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's really what we're here to talk about today is how does this crisis provide opportunities for change, opportunities for innovation, and opportunities for really moving higher education forward so that it makes even greater contributions to the economic and cultural and social fabric of society. The importance of organizational context or that organizational mindset cannot be overstated. And I've been at Texas State for 20 years now, but I've spent time at Mississippi State, at the University of Tampa, at the University of Memphis, and some other places. But here at Texas State, we're fortunate to have a president, leadership, and a culture that's collaborative, very strategic in nature, and is really driven by a commitment to understanding and anticipating the needs of all of our stakeholders. So obviously students first and foremost, but also government, legislators, broader accountability with society and taxpayers, obviously our faculty and staff. But we have a deep commitment to stakeholders, and that is fundamental to any kind of innovation, whether it's in the private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, whatever that might be. Also important is that leadership recognizes and trusts the people that are working within it. And at Texas State, we're fortunate, we're driven by a strategic plan that actually ensures that resource allocation matches our strategic plan, but that there is flexibility. And so ultimately at leaders, it's up to us to ensure that we're instilling a trust-based culture where individual employees, in our case, faculty and staff, and even students who work on our campuses, have the opportunity to drive that innovation culture. What I will say about March 2020, and like many universities, we had our spring break, and then we took an additional week for faculty and students and staff, and really the entire nation for that matter, to come to grips with the situation that we were being faced with. We found the transition to remote learning to be highly invigorating. And yes, it was stressful, as others have mentioned. For faculty members, it wasn't just about the technology. What happened was they began to rethink their courses in terms of learning activities, teaching approaches, different models, different course designs, which are really fundamental. The technology should not drive the course design. It should be the other way around. So I'm very enthusiastic, but again, I'm highly optimistic that this has provided a platform because faculty and students, as several panelists have mentioned, for the first time for many of them, were engaged in the online environment in a very different way. All of us do our banking. Increasingly, we're using telemedicine. We're doing many other things, engaging with our friends and family on Facebook and social media. But learning in an online environment is very different. And I'm sure we'll talk some about that. But I do want to say that the transition has really opened up minds as well as experiences, and those are fundamental for innovation to occur.
Thank you, Debbie. That's very encouraging. I know, speaking from experience, to learn more about online education, I accepted an offer 6 years ago to teach online. Oh, yeah. And I found out that despite my initial reservations, it can work.
It can.
You're right.
It can work real well.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of adjustment, but it can work very well. Yeah. Thank you, Debbie.
You're welcome.
Last but certainly not least, Dean Watson. As Larry mentioned, Kirk Watson is the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. It's been my honor and pleasure to deal with him the preceding 9 years when he was a senator. In fact, a senator from my area here, a state senator from my area here in Austin, and he has always been a very strong supporter of higher education and education generally. Dean Watson, let me ask you this question. As we've heard, there are a lot of people across the country who see this as a time to reevaluate higher education and how it's done. You agree first with that? And if so, what do you think is the best way to approach that evaluation? What should be the key considerations that we look at?
Thanks, and thanks for having me on this panel. Well, just listening to the previous answers that you've had tells you that, yeah, this is, and I agree, this is a good time. I like both. I wrote them down. One of it is that COVID is pushing us forward, and I agree with that. And then, of course, I always get a kick out of here, and we shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. And I share the optimism. The truth of the matter is that the way I've talked about COVID is the COVID opportunity, and not just in higher education, but it really applies in higher ed, which has, as you know, in a variety of areas over time has been somewhat slow to do things differently. It tends to be one of those places where the ivory tower wants to do things the way it's always been done. So what the COVID opportunity did is it said, all right, everybody's in a timeout. Now, I use that because I don't get to watch any sports right now, so I just feel like I need to say something relates to sports. But really, what's happened is we've all been told to go back to our corners or go to the locker rooms, or we're on the sidelines. And the question is, are we just going to try to go out and run the same old plays when we can? Or are we instead going to really analyze, like you ought to do at halftime or during a timeout, and say, no, here's what we've learned from that, and let's move forward. So my hope, and I share the optimism, my hope is that that's what we do. In part, I have that hope because I've seen how much work has had to go in to turning on a dime, right? Mm-hmm. In March, everybody had to switch. And there's been an enormous amount of really smart, really good work that has gone into trying to change to meet immediate needs. And I think that leads to the second part of your question. Yeah, I agree. And I think we ought to take advantage of this moment. But the other part of it is, how do we move forward? And I think one of the first things we have to do is realize that when we come out of the timeout, we are not then administering to a COVID situation. We will be in a post-COVID condition, which means there are things we can't do right now that we will be able to do. Mm-hmm. And so we don't need to think that everything we're doing right now is the way it's always going to be. There needs to be a true analysis, in my view, of what did we really learn? What did we see? What did we see as failures? What did not work as well? And then ask the question, why? We ought to ask, what are the costs? And I mean that both in the sense of dollars and cents. Where do we have savings? Where did we create efficiencies? But I also mean in terms of the costs of what education really means. We don't, I don't think, want to boil down education to just reading, writing, arithmetic. The college education experience is also where so many of us, for the first time, came in contact with other ideas and other thoughts and learned from those. I did like the comment that everybody's smart, but I've got a couple of professors that if they were still around, they'd tell you they knew at least one that wasn't that smart. But the point being, part of the cost of this is we're losing that interaction. How do we also bring that back? And then I'll shut up on this, but I'll say this last thing. As we come out of the timeout, and if we do this right and we start analyzing it, we will also allow for some trial and error. Because when we get to the other side, when we get to the new condition and we're past COVID, which we all hope and pray happens soon, there's going to be some experimentation. Mm-hmm. And that's what this ought to spur. When we talk about trying to take advantage of the opportunity, we want to spur that innovation, and it's not all going to work. And so those at the legislature and then others are going to have to say, that didn't work. And if people are ready to change, they're not held to account in such a way that there's retribution. It is instead an opportunity for higher ed to not recreate a past, but to recreate a future. And that will require some trial and error.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that note of optimism that really I've heard from all four of you. And also I appreciate your sports analogies, Dean Watson. Another note of encouragement is that tonight baseball is back.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's a good sign. It's a good sign we're returning to normal.
Yep.
Let me go back to the top here to Dr. Hallmark. And now, as Debbie Thorne mentioned, going a little more into the details about what we learned from the spring change and what we're going to do for moving forward. Dr. Hallmark, give us a few details for the audience about this on a dime change to remote instruction this past spring. What were the successes? What were the failures? And then following up on the Dean Watson's comment, what will the fall look like in light of what you've learned?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I don't want post-COVID, say fall of 21. I don't want post-COVID fall of 21 to look like fall of 19. We really need to have learned from what we've experienced in the last few months and will be experiencing and learning from in the following few months. And I think that's the real opportunity for optimism. Where can we really grow and make great advances here in the next few months as we begin to look to the post-COVID environment that we're in. You know, we act like in higher ed, we act like it's always been this way, that as if higher education that we do today looks anything like what Socrates or Plato did, and it's simply not true. The current model of higher education in America is maybe 80 years old. You know, if you think of the post World War II GI generation, or maybe you want to point to the 60s with the Great Society, where it began to be more accessible to low income and persons of color. You know, it really is not a long history of how we are currently doing higher ed. And so when we get locked into this idea of this is the way we've always done it, we're on a dead end street, because this is not the way we've always done it. And we need to be continually evolving and adapting to where we're going in the future. And that's the mindset we've tried to be preaching amongst my colleagues in the A&M system is, okay, what do we learn from this? How can we construct the environment once we survive this to be more conducive to meeting the needs of our Texas citizens who are seeking out higher education? And so that's where I want to be when I come to the post-COVID environment. Now, what happened in March was really an interesting, to say the least, an interesting experience. And one of the things I think was interesting was that 3 of my campuses, at the point where the chancellor said, okay, if you need another week for spring break, take it in order to make that transition. 3 of my campuses, those presidents called me and said, do we have to? Because they were ready. And I got 11 campuses, and that means 8 of them were not ready, and very much appreciated that extra week. But I thought it was great that 3 of them were ready to go, because they already had developed that infrastructure to be ready to turn on a dime. They already had a significant inventory of their courses ready to go and were available. And I think moving forward, that's one of those lessons, is that, God forbid, should this happen again, I want that to be true of all 11. That we are ready on a moment's notice to adapt to the environment in that sort of way. But what we found in March was that we had faculty who were tremendously adaptable, and we had faculty who weren't sure how to turn their computer on, who suddenly we were asking them to teach remotely. We had faculty who had not engaged significantly with the learning management system that we were using to put the courses out there. And that's a small percentage, frankly, but it doesn't matter. Those courses have to be online and remote at a moment's notice, just like those who had been highly engaged in the online offerings. So what we did in March, I think, was the term I've been using is a emergency transition to remote learning. I've not been calling that online. It was an emergency response, and it's remote learning. But really to do online learning well is, as Debbie was talking about, a reimagining of the course, rethinking the course of how it is best taught in this format, and redesigning the course with those learning outcomes in mind. And so what I really want to learn from that experience is we survived it. I think we did the best we could. The faculty were amazing. The students were amazing in adapting. But how do we take those courses and be ready better next time to offer it in an online environment? Because I think we are going to see more and more, as I mentioned first time I was speaking, more and more online offerings because the market is requesting that. We're still going to have the face-to-face. I will contend that at least for the rest of my career, that's not going away. But we are seeing a growing demand and a growing need for online offerings, and we need to be better prepared for that as we're moving forward.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. And of course, you're absolutely right. For our viewing audience, we tend to think of the typical college student today as between 18 and 22 going to a 4-year traditional university full-time, when in fact that only refers to about 20% of those who are seeking post-secondary education or credentials today. The vast majority of students are what we call non-traditional, meaning they're over 25 and or working a full-time job and or with a family of their own to support. And so I think you're absolutely right that what you're doing here, although the expediting of it was a response to an emergency, the benefits will flow after it's over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Johnson, I want to drill down further on the situation of our historically Black colleges and universities. Specifically, does the recovery funding from Congress for higher education, does it address the technology infrastructure needs of the HBCUs, and particularly the small private HBCUs?
Well, Tom, I think that the COVID-19 situation put such a distressed movement on historically Black colleges and universities that the CARES Act touches on about 15% of what's necessary to establish the infrastructure for technology and for historically Black colleges to compete. So therefore, there is a need for additional support in that particular area because most of the HBCUs, particularly the private HBCUs, which are primarily faith-based colleges and universities, they tend to live off of tuition. They're about 95% tuition driven, and additional revenues make up about less than 10% of what they will bring in, and so and coupled with very small endowments, which there's no rainy day fund. So basically, they would need additional help to recover and sustain at the level of services that they were providing prior to COVID-19. So to answer your question, I think that the CARES Act did address some of their infrastructure, broadband infrastructure needs, IT needs, and technology needs. However, there is a lot of room left to assist those institutions just in the ability not just to provide good services, but to survive. Because for many of them, they're not looking at just innovation and survive and providing good service and thriving. They're looking at survival. Is the message that I received from a couple of the college presidents just today.
Yeah. I didn't know. In a past life, I was an administrator. I was provost at the University of Dallas. I did not know that these small HBCUs are 95% tuition driven. I mean, that combined with a small endowment, it means you're living on the edge every day. So I take your point.
And on top of that, over 90% of their students are on financial aid. And so many of them, if they've built a new dormitory and with those students not coming back physically on campus, then they're not seeing those room and board revenues. They're not seeing those meal plan revenues, and they're not seeing the bookstore revenue. So all of those things are a major disruption in the revenues of the institution. So they're going to have to really be creative as they move forward with online services and distance learning.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Before we go next to Dr. Thorne, in about 5 minutes, we will start answering questions from our viewing audience. So you members of the audience, if you want to type in your questions, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Dr. Thorne, going even more into the details here, the nitty gritty of making online learning better as a result of what we've gone through. What do you think are the most important factors for student success in online learning?
It's a very important question, given that we know that obviously we made a transition to remote learning, but again, several universities or university systems have already decided to go to fully online, and that we'll have more and more online courses in the future. For me, student success in online learning is really dependent on two major categories. And one that Richard has touched on in particular has a lot to do with technology readiness and technology availability, as well as something as simple as an appropriate study environment, learning environment. And, you know, as we think back to March 2020, obviously wasn't just higher ed. The K through 12 environment was definitely affected. I've often wondered what it would have been like to be a parent, whether you had college students, high school students, or a kindergartner, and trying to basically homeschool, making sure you have the right number of devices, the computer, the tablets, making sure your Wi-Fi, your broadband, whatever kind of access was appropriate, and then trying to oversee those learning activities and making sure that students are staying on task. All of those factors are important at the college level as well. And like many other panelists have mentioned, we had laptops that we made available in March. We had hotspots, and I don't exactly know how all that works, but we had hotspots that we made available to students who were from rural areas or more remote areas, or whose family or community did not have the appropriate resources. So the technology readiness and access, and reliable access in particular, is so important. The other big category has a lot to do with what I call academic maturity and the students' motivations for learning. And by and large, when we talk about the traditional undergraduate student who is looking for that face-to-face engagement, many of them are very technology savvy, much more savvy than probably all of us are combined. But learning is different than social media or playing video games with people from around the world. And so that academic maturity and the motivations for learning are so critical. This is the reason I believe that online learning has been particularly successful with what we call the non-traditional market, which you've pointed out is a very big market. And those students who are either returning to school or who never had the opportunity are now coming to college with families, with jobs, with lots of other obligations. They have a different level of general maturity, much less very different motivations for achieving academic success. So really, you know, taking a look at both factors. One is very basic and very technological. The other is what's the student's mindset and what is their readiness for the online environment.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Thorne. That's been my experience teaching online also. There's always the fear of students falling through the cracks.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question here of Dean Watson before we turn to our audience Q&A. Dean Watson, talking from a very practical standpoint, what's going to be needed if we're going to move to more online provision of higher ed? Is it easy as just teaching the course in front of the computer, or is it a whole different enterprise?
Well, I'm not sure I can improve on the answers that a couple of folks have already given in this, but let me try to kind of just boil it down. One is the way you just asked that question. You got to build the technology. You got to have the technology to allow for it to really happen. And we've heard that as a thread throughout all of this. And it's like having a quality textbook, you know, to use. It's not the old book, but it's the quality of the tool that you're using to teach. I'd say the second thing that you have to do is you have to make sure, and we've talked about this a little bit, and it's a thread that runs through here, is the faculty is prepared for it. And you know, I don't just mean, although I do mean that they have to know how to use the technology, right? Particularly if they're doing some sort of what we're referring to as high flex at U of H, which is you've got some people right in front of you and some people at the very same time are on the computers. How are they all getting much of the same kind of learning experience, even though you've got differences there? And you know, is the professor trained in, is the teacher trained in how you deal with both? Or even if you don't have both, how you just do it that way, so that not only they know how to use the technology, and if something goes down, they're ready to jump in at a moment, you know, at a second. And then how do you teach well under these circumstances? You know, a lot of people have been doing this a long time, and they have tricks, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They are able to stimulate thought that teaches. And can that always translate if you don't have the contact? And are they going to be able to have contact otherwise? And will they do the contact otherwise? The third thing I'd mention is student needs. I've heard that as a thread, you know, everything from having the student having the technology to even having, I've heard it said quiet places. When I heard that a minute ago, I thought, you know, I used to have my favorite room in the library, that I used to go. And as we all have learned from learning what everybody's doing at their homes on these Zoom calls we've all been in, I know everybody's dog. I know everybody who has cats. I know when their kids are yelling at them. And so you got to have a quiet place you have to have student needs also met. And then of course, I'll get into things like labs and how do you do internships and make sure that they have those sort of educational experiences. That's not just this computer and how you do that. So it's not just as easy as saying, okay, let's flick a switch and we're all going to be, and I like the difference between online and remote, but we're just going to flick a switch and we'll be ready to go. I'm hoping that part of what happens is that there will be effort put into training our teachers and training our professors to teach differently when we're on the other side of this.
Yes. Amen to that. Thank you, Dean Watson. We now have some time for questions from our audience, and I'm looking here. We have a number of great questions. First question, I think this is a very important question because as we know, or as our audience will want to know, a number of, and here talking about K-12, a number of K-12 districts in the Valley don't have internet access. So question here from someone in our audience is, what innovations can school districts use to help those who don't have access to the internet or who have poor signals in their remote areas?
So I'll take a stab at that. And this goes back to the history of distance ed, which actually goes back to the late 1700s. When correspondence education was developed, because we had finally developed a postal system. So what I do know about some K through 12 environments, even in March and April and May, that they literally were using hard copies, whether it was mail, whether it was a family stopping by to pick up hard copies of assignments and exams and so forth. That can be effective. That can be very effective. It's really about what the instructor, or in this case, the teacher, is designing and what is happening in the home. What are those students able to concentrate on those lessons? So Sometimes a very simple solution could work, not ideal, of course, but that's one thing that I know has already happened.
Thank you, Dr. Thorne.
Yeah, I might throw in there, if I may, Dr. Lindsay.
Go ahead.
Dr. Thorne mentioned earlier about issuing laptops and hotspots and those sorts of things. And we did as well, and I'm sure all the universities did across the state and country as best they were able. Those are really Band-Aids. What is a larger systematic solution to that challenge? And I think that's one that we as a society ought to be discussing and debating and evaluating what the costs are versus the benefits, because the individual solutions got us through that crisis and will get us through the fall as needed. But again, thinking, how do we want to do this? Not how do we survive, but how do we really want to design and do this to where we can best serve all of our individuals, whether they're in a rural environment and don't have access, or an urban environment and don't have access. Either way, they're just disconnected from the higher education opportunities in that situation.
Yes.
The only thing I'll add to that is that I know some places have played with the concept of hotspots, turning a parking lot into a hotspot so that people could, in some instances, bring their children, but at the college level, go and have places to sit or sit in cars and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Those are Band-Aids. That is, in my view, simply trying to recreate a past. We need to be asking the questions the way I was talking about it earlier. We need to be asking the question, how do we improve on the system so that it's not a Band-Aid, but it actually makes things better?
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Dean Watson. Another question from our audience is this, and probably something that you administrators are thinking about now. Their question is, how is online learning affecting college funding due to the lack of board and housing revenue? And how are college towns going to hold up without students contributing to the local economies? Probably a question on the minds of a lot of people today. This question's addressed to any and all of you. Who would like to start?
Hadn't crossed my mind. Yeah, it is a significant question. How many students will show up, whether they will stay, what will the health conditions be in terms of allowing them and enabling them to stay. We are finding we began surveying our students quite early, and I'm sure the other universities did well in terms of what their desire was, and we've been monitoring the students who are new admits for this fall. Overwhelmingly, they want to come back. There's no question that there is an overwhelming desire to come back or to come for the first time in the case of new students. But the bottom line is if I'm just hypothetically a mom and dad sitting in Midland, do I want to have my child in College Station or Houston or San Marcos or wherever, that kind of distance away? We live in a large state. And so I think there will be some last minute decisions based on the health and safety of the local region, at least the perceived health and safety of the local region. And I'm sure in the case of all of our universities, we believe we've created a low risk environment for them to come back to, but they're still a long way from home. And I think that will have a significant impact on our revenue, and it'll impact, perhaps in a devastating way, the impact of local economies, particularly towns like San Marcos and College Station that have such a huge influx of numbers during those academic years. I'm sure it affects Houston, but in a different way because your city is different. But those smaller towns that have larger universities, in my case, A&M Commerce, a little bitty town with 13,000 students at it. So that's a tremendous economic impact on the local community.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I would agree with James that this is part of what wakes us up at night, frankly, and that these dollars translate into people. They translate into impacts on communities such as San Marcos and College Station. And there's also an underlying concern with student engagement. So I've read some observers or even critics who believe that the desire on the part of universities to return to face-to-face is a desire to remain the same. And that's not exactly how I would frame it. I would frame it as a desire to return to a student engagement model that we know creates success. And so, you know, pairing up the concept of the revenue shortfalls, many of the elements on campus that are funded by fees that students pay, whether it's the bus fee, whether it's the fee for counseling and mental health services. Many of these areas are funded by fees, and they have employees that are funded by fees. So we're cognizant of the economic impact and really want to be sure that we are good corporate citizens, good citizens to the state, to our community and beyond. But there's also a student engagement piece that is driving our interest, especially for the traditional undergraduate population that, as Kirk said earlier, really comes to college for more than the math and the science and the English. They're coming for leadership and maturity and exposure to new ideas and new opportunities. So yes, it is definitely on our minds.
Understood. What would you like to see the state of Texas do in light of the straitened circumstances that our public universities will be facing in the fall?
I'll start. I'll answer that kind of where I started, and that is what I don't want is for the state. I'll start with a negative, which I don't typically do, but it is what I don't want is the state to knee jerk that it knows what the solution is. Our universities ought to be seen as the places where good creative thought can occur. And my experience where I am and what I'm watching happen there and what I hear in two different systems is that our universities our college systems and universities are looking at how they use this as an opportunity. And I know that that's actually happening. So COVID has created a laboratory, if you will. And what I would want the state to do is listen to the experts in that, the ones that are on the ground, the ones that, as I mentioned a minute ago, shifted on a dime and are now figuring out what they learned from that and how best to deal with it. Because I don't think we're going to, I think everybody's going to have some more experimentation happen here in the fall. We were recently trying to schedule a speaker for the first day of class, and we were just all talking about that we were going to have somebody speak on the first day, and we all kind of looked at each other on Zoom and said, you know, first day is probably going to be really ugly. How about the beginning of the next week? And so there's going to be some more experimentation. The key here is to allow that, maybe set some goals, but not knee jerk that we now have all of the answers when we still have some work to do.
Thank you, Dean Watson. If I understand you correctly, what you're saying here is that the state of Texas should exercise some humility and seek to remove any obstacles preventing the universities from acting in an entrepreneurial way to address this.
I think that is, I try not to ever use the word humility when I'm talking about the state, but yeah, I mean, the bottom line is listen to them, bring them in. You know, one of the things that bothers me right now about the interim is that because of COVID, we're not having the interim hearings that we normally have. We're not having the discussions. So I worry greatly the impact that's going to have on a legislative session, particularly a difficult legislative session because of budget numbers. Mm-hmm. And the lesson ought to apply there too. Don't just try to recreate the past like it was. Take the COVID opportunity to see if there are other things can do. And that does, you're right, probably requires some humility, but it also says be creative and we'll reward it.
Yes. Thank you.
I might mention that I think the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board has been fairly responsive and good over the past few months. In fact, Commissioner Keller just announced, I guess it was yesterday, some diversion of funding and some directive funding that I think is specific to this environment in terms of identifying those individuals who are out of work and trying to get them into certificate and degree programs that would be able to prepare them for the future, but also in terms of some money that's directed toward open educational resources and open learning environments to incentivize the transition. And that's a cost savings long-term for our students, decrease in debt, but is also a direct response to the environment we have now where we're moving to a more online environment. So I think the coordinating board is headed in the right direction. I would encourage that they continue to move in that direction.
Yes.
I probably would only add one other thing, and that is that the state of Texas, I mean, the coordinating board and our legislators really have to take the time to understand the gravity of our situation. And it goes back to listening to the folks who are boots on the ground, who working it, living it every day, and understand also that there are different nuances in the way that COVID-19 is affecting different university sizes, systems, and colleges, and then come up with an approach that's not a one size fits all, but more of a tailor-made approach that would really, really help the institutions that we have here in the state of Texas reach and service at a high level all of our students.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. This has gone by much too quickly. Doctors Hallmark, Johnson, Thorne, Dean Watson, thank you very much for taking the time and presenting here. A lot of great information and a lot of cause for optimism as the country pulls together and tries to move forward to the next step. So thank you again. And thank you to our audience for watching.
Thanks, everybody. Be
Thank
safe.
you very much.